Okay, shall we get started then? You ready? All right, I'm going to do a very quick intro for Robin and then give her plenty of time to go forward. From what I can tell, Robin got her BA about 18 years ago in English from Cal State University of Long Beach, where I was born, was in Long Beach. So I'm very familiar with that campus. It's a great campus. My wife went to school there too. She had an MA in rhetoric and composition from Loyola Marymount University. And over the last 10 years, she's been the director of operations at the UCLA Clinical and Translation Science Grant Submission Unit. And she does a lot of work there. She leads a collaborative team that provides administrative and infrastructure support to researchers who are applying for grants and funding opportunities. And she's also primary project manager and oversees a large portfolio of grant applications. And Robin also provides grant writing and editing services. And I'm sure that's all going to be very helpful in today's talk about practical tips for grant applications. So please give Robin a warm welcome today for her presentation. Thank you in advance. Keith, you got to clap loud.
Wow, a real clap. It's so unusual in remote meetings now, but thank you. I guess that reminds me I maybe should update my LinkedIn profile. But yeah, so thank you guys for inviting me today. We talked about, practical tips for grant applications, and I am by no means a grant application expert, but we do hundreds of applications every year, and so I have sort of a sense of what those best practices are. And so I thought today maybe we could go through just some highlights of things in key areas that I see, things to be aware of. And then at the end, I'll point you to some additional resources, because while my office in particular offers grant submission support, there are a wealth of other resources as well. And so if you have, particular questions or areas that you're struggling with and you don't know who to go to, hopefully some of that can also point you in the right direction. And then hopefully if we have time at the end, I'm happy to take questions that you might have about your own particular issues or questions that you might have. So feel free to think about those as I'm going. So I think I'm going to try and share my screen. See if I can put this into presenter mode. No, it's on the wrong screen. Okay, can you guys see this, the PowerPoint, and it's in presenter mode? Yeah, yes. Okay, all right, got it right. Okay, so just an overview for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the CTSI, we kind of exist, this is our mission and our vision, but the way that I usually explain it is like, we are here to help propel clinical translational science forward at UCLA with our CTSI partners in whatever way that makes sense for each of our different program areas. So this is just kind of a quick rundown of all those different areas that you might interact with as an investigator. Some of these areas can help with the grant submission process. And so I'm also going to talk about them. And just to give you an idea, a couple of years ago, I put together this slide. Don't worry about it, I know it's text heavy, but I put together this slide thinking through, within the CTSI, even just outside of my office, like what are all those areas that provide support for a grant application? So whether it's like online tools or community engagement, all these different areas often have services that they provide that help you with your grant application process. So I'll go over some of these in more detail, and then I'm going to show the slide at the end too, in case any of these sound like areas that you want to engage with, because these are also other groups that can help with different areas of the grant application you might be struggling with. So specifically for my office, grant submission unit, we sort of see the grant application process as a sort of like it's a life cycle, and whether it's you don't know which funding opportunity to go after, or you need to find collaborators, putting the bits and pieces together to actually submit something. And then, if it's not funded, then you sort of start that whole life cycle over again. And so we really try and take this holistic approach to the grant submission process, because, you might run into issues at every step of the way. And so we're always trying to identify like what are the biggest needs or areas that we can provide support throughout this life cycle process. So when I think about it, I sort of think, well, first of all, you need a grant, like funding opportunity to, you know, what are you going to apply for? You need the right expertise. Usually that involves like brainstorming with your team, getting the ideas put down on paper to develop the proposal and then submitting it. And so it's a sort of process that we try and help you throughout that whole thing. And so my presentation will kind of go through each of these components, and I'm going to specifically focus on the proposal development because that's what my office particularly helps with, but just kind of think about it in that holistic sense. So the first step is, you know, choosing the right grant, right? Like, what are you going to apply for? So here I have some examples of just basic R01s from the NIH. You know, these are very standard investigator-initiated grants that faculty at all levels, whether you're an early stage investigator or not, can apply to. But sometimes it can be really hard to parse out what these mean. You know, if they're all R01s, how do you know which one's the right one for you, right? So I gave these three as an example because these are what NIH would call parent grants. But you know, one of them requires you to have a clinical trial. If you're a basic scientist, you're not interested in that. There's another one where a clinical trial is not allowed. And so if you are planning a clinical study, you shouldn't be applying for that one. And then on top of that, you know, not every NIH agency participates in every single parent grant. So if you wanted to apply for a clinical trial, but you wanted to submit it to the National Cancer Institute, this FOA is not going to work for you. You know, so there's often you know, in the early stages, when I meet with investigators, we often talk through, you know, do you have a funding opportunity identified? If so, like, let's look at it, make sure that you are eligible to apply. If you don't have one in mind, you know, a lot of times what we do is kind of brainstorm, like, what are the topics? What's your project about? And then sort of work backwards and look at the funding landscape. And not just NIH, but like we'll look at other agencies, foundations, and things, and just see if there are other funding opportunities that sort of fit with what you're thinking about in terms of what kind of project you want to get funded. So it's always helpful to have this early on in the process because it can really help determine what components you're going to need to put together for that grant application. So even though these are all R01s, they all have very unique requirements that pertain to the human subjects, just as an example. Whether you apply to NIH or another funding agency, that's going to maybe determine the page limits that you get, the formatting that you get. And so we always try and start this process a little bit earlier if we can. So some key components to successful grants facilitation, I think, is number one, grant proposal management, which can include, you know, setting up all those pieces of paper, you know, the bio sketches, letters of support, boilerplate, you know, these are sort of standard things that we see on all grant applications. And to go into the process kind of understanding all that's involved makes each of these components a little bit easier to deal with and understand the scope. So, you know, if you're applying for a large center grant, you might have 100 key personnel and therefore you need 100 bio sketches. That's a lot. Probably takes a little bit more time than, you know, an R01 where maybe you have 4 to 6 key personnel. So it helps to look at that to understand sort of the scope or the size of the project that you're working with. I think editing and proofreading is a really important component. You know, having somebody provide you editorial review, even if it's just for like grammar and consistency, just making sure that something reads really well and that it's responsive to the funding opportunity, because I think every time I work with an investigator, I think their idea is great. I think everybody at UCLA who comes to me, great, this is such a great project, let's get it funded, but it doesn't always translate to paper that way. And so having resources at hand to help with the editing and proofreading can really make your application look and read just as strong as it is in your own mind. And then, you know, how do you get to that? Administrative support can be helpful, which is what, you know, my office provides. But, you know, the project management help to have somebody set up a checklist and a timeline to make sure you stay on track, that things aren't getting forgotten along the way. So you don't want to get to the day before it's due and you realize you've forgotten a key component because nobody knew it was required. Coordinating regular planning meetings, either with your leadership team or everybody that's involved, or trying to figure out how to keep that momentum and that communication up so that your final product is as strong as it can, because it's had the engagement and involvement of everybody that's has a stake in the application. Continuing with this, if you have more than one site involved, having a sense of what's involved with site coordination in terms of like collecting all the documents from other sites that are not your site can take a bit of time sometimes. Having somebody serve as a single point of contact for being that conduit could help avoid sort of the confusion of, maybe one site sending documents to the PI, another one sending it to the fund manager, or maybe another one sending it to me, to kind of reduce the risk of errors happening along the way or communication breaking down, especially the more sites you have, the more complex this can be. Just grant application advice and research, having somewhere where you can go to just ask questions. Sometimes those funding agency requirements are really bizarre and they're hard to interpret. Or if if this is your first time doing a clinical trial and you've never seen the documentation that goes into it, it can be really helpful to know who to reach out to or to ask those questions, because what we don't want to see is that you put your heart and soul into an application and then it gets triaged because you forgot to address the human subjects in a very specific way that the agency was asking you for. So just being able to reach out and ask those questions or know who to go is really key. And then sort of on the earlier side of the process, identifying the funding opportunities and the collaborations that are going to make your application successful. So sometimes it's needing help finding the collaborators, finding the mentorship, finding additional sites maybe to do some of your enrollment at. So when you're thinking through the type of project that you want to do, having a sense of those two pieces can earlier in the process can also be helpful. So the next section of slides, I'm just going to highlight some of the best practices for some of the most common pieces of grant application. And most of these are coming from an NIH perspective, but I think the best practices can apply pretty broadly to any kind of grant application or funding opportunity. So, we always like to say the failure rate is typically pretty high. So we often set people the goal to reapplying every round until they're funded. The majority of people do not get funded on their first try. If you do, that's fantastic. We want to hear from you. Tell everybody about what you did right. We want to learn from you. But in general, the NIH does a presentation every year about how hard it is to get funding from them. I think there's something like last I heard, I think it was about a 15-20% success rate on your first try. So it's just good to keep in mind to not get disheartened about that process. And the thing is that, every unfunded application is an opportunity to incorporate those critiques and continually improve your application over time so it gets stronger and stronger until it's eventually funded. If you're really struggling with where to start, looking at NIH Reporter to see what's been funded in your area of interest, your topic area. If you have potential competitors and limited competitions, you can also see what's funded there. Using the, what's publicly available to see. So one of the ways that we use this, sometimes we have early stage investigators who come to us and they have questions about which, NIH institution they should apply to. They're like, well, my topic is, part this, part that, it could go either way, but we don't know which one is going to review it more favorably. And so you can use NIH Reporter to see what those agencies have funded in your area and see which one seems like a better fit in coordination with talking with like mentors and the program officer. But seeing what's publicly available can be really helpful for figuring some of that out. And then, obviously having a discussion with your program officer to determine programmatic fit. Some of the program officers we work with are very blunt and they'll straight up tell you, this is not a good fit, but here's the funding opportunity you should be applying to. You know, I think that they have a directive to really help you get your application to the best place, like where it should really go to get the best review possible. And then, you know, once you've gotten there and you've identified the funding opportunity announcement that you want to apply to, you know it's a good programmatic fit, it's time to read that announcement. A lot of them tend to have the same language and it can get really dry and boring, but every once in a while they'll throw in some kind of specific that has a weird requirement. And it's really helpful to just get in the habit of reading for those quirks so that you know how to address them when it comes time to customizing your application for that announcement. So after that, put together your application. I think it's good to go. If you have the time, you know, looking across, and I'll get to editing and reviewing in a little bit, but, you know, thinking about making sure your terminology is consistent across all your components, and it can just give your application that sort of like fine touch, you know, makes it look like you were really thorough. So when we're reviewing grant applications, sometimes we'll start with like, do you have a set of acronyms that you use that are standard, or is there a specific terminology that you prefer for different roles that people have? And then we'll make sure that that's in the narrative, it's in the budget, it's in the bio sketch, you know, every single separate piece that multiple people might be working on, that we're all kind of using a standard set of terminology to give the application a cohesive look across all those disparate pieces that come together at the end. And then always being aware of any updates. So if you are typically an NIH investigator, making sure that you're keeping track of the notices of any time they change anything, because it's always changing. And so it's always good to be up on the latest updates to make sure you're not missing any of those as well. So let's say you submitted the application, didn't get funded, you're going to resubmit. Time to respond to those critiques. So I think it's always best practice to read your summary statement before contacting the program officer, to make sure you have read and understand, you know, the major critiques, where your issues might be, and then have a set of maybe questions to walk through with the program officer. Because part of the conversation with them is determining whether you should resubmit or whether it should go in as a new application based on the types of critiques that you got. I think it's really helpful to categorize the major critiques, because a lot of times when you do respond, you're not going to have a lot of space to do it. And so if you can chunk things into big topics, you can start to see the patterns that emerge. So if you see a review, you know, one reviewer maybe mentions that you don't have appropriate biostatistical support, and then another one, you know, mentions that you know, your investigator leadership looks a little light, you know, you might start to see that, oh, maybe there's an issue with the investigator side of the critiques, and maybe we need to look at who our leadership is and adding, changing roles and things like that. When you start to compose your response to the critiques, you know, I think it's always helpful to kind of start with acknowledging and thanking the reviewers for their thoughtful feedback. I say this because this is typically not your first sense. You know, when we get those critiques, we get upset for you. We're like, they're so mean. Why are they saying this? This isn't true. They misread this. And we oftentimes come with this like anger because we feel like somebody misinterpreted the work. But I think if you start with just acknowledgement and thanks, it can set you on the right path to figuring out how to address critiques in a kind of a non-combative way. And then if there are critiques that you've received that you don't agree with, or you think maybe they misread, or maybe they said something was missing, but it was clearly on page, you know, 250, it's okay to not address that critique if you're providing a rationale for why you're not changing it. So you can say, you know, even though reviewers critique this, we note, or we've now clarified or highlighted that it's on page blah, 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 you know, to let them know that like maybe they missed it the first time. And again, you know, if you're struggling with any of this, my office can also help kind of walk you through some of the nuance of how to put that together in a polite way as well. So another big component is obviously the biosketch. My office does a lot of this. I will say we have just done an updated, we recorded a webinar actually, and we're going to post it on the CTSI website shortly that goes through all of the major changes that have happened for this most recent update. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. I just checked today. It's not up online yet, but it will be very shortly. So most applications are going to require you to have a bio sketch for every key personnel on the application. And so I kind of just wanted to do a very high level overview of all the changes for the applications submitted on or after January 25th. So I'm guessing that's probably most applications. It's today the 24th. So major changes, section B now has this new section in bold here, scientific appointments, which are any kind of domestic or foreign appointments, including affiliations with foreign entities or governments, regardless of whether you get paid for that position or not. So the NIH really wants you to be clear about any of those positions that you currently hold. And then the other kind of new requirement is they wanted everything in reverse chronological order. And then section D, formerly called research support, is not a component anymore. So they've gotten rid of section D, but not to worry. Anything that you had in section D that you still want to highlight in your bio sketch, you can now just put in section A instead. And again, the webinar that I have kind of goes in much more detail if you want to know like how to do that or what other people are doing right now. It's a long presentation, so you can look at that later if you'd like. So another component that my office particularly works on a lot is the letters of support. So some of the kind of brainstorming that I have with investigators, we talk through, like what's the purpose of a letter of support? We only want to include letters if they add strength to your application, if they are going to enhance your application in any way, or if they're required by the funding opportunity announcement. So in general, letters shouldn't just be like de facto letters of support where it's just people just saying how great you are. It should really have a commitment to you or your application. So if they are providing you samples, if they're collaborating with you, if they are going to be on an advisory board, any kind of engagement with you on your project that is maybe not clear because maybe they're not co-investigators, they're not on the budget and you don't have their bio sketch, letter support can be a good way of describing who this person is and why their experience or background is necessary for your engagement with them on your application. Institutional support. So if you're an early stage investigator, a lot of times having a letter that speaks to how your institution is supporting you in your application can be really helpful for demonstrating that you really do have that commitment and engagement from your institution. And as you think through the requirements of your funding, the particular funding opportunity that you're responding to, you have to think through like, do I actually need a letter of support? I mean, sometimes you don't, right? Smaller applications that are pretty straightforward, maybe a letter of support is not going to enhance or strengthen your application. If you're applying for a large center grant, you might have 300 letters and still think that's not enough, so everything is really dependent on what the needs of the opportunity are. And then, sometimes the funding opportunity announcement will have very specific requirements as well, where they'll explicitly state you need a letter of support from everybody on your board or from your institution that says X, Y, and Z. And so if that's a requirement, obviously we'll include that. But if you, let's say you have a application that involves a community component, you might want to think through like would having a letter from that community group or the agency that you're working with strengthen your application to really hit home the level of engagement with you. So you determine you need letters. What next? How do you write good letters? Again, I have a whole nother presentation on that, so I'm not going to get too much into that, but we always want to go back to the question of what's going to strengthen your application. And so it's helpful to sort of think about these letters are going to reviewers who maybe are not familiar with you or whoever is providing the letter. So the letter kind of has to include enough information to give them context. And that is information that might not fit anywhere else in the application, due to page limitations or things like that. And so think about what's the least amount of information that you need to give to the reviewers to give them the context of who's providing the letter and why they're providing it. If there are any kinds of commitments, like if they are a consultant and they're committing to a specific number of hours per year, or if they're on your advisory board and they're committing to meeting annually in person, all those things should be incorporated into the letter to kind of hit home the specificity of the signatory's engagement with you on the application. So I've kind of mentioned these in passing, but some of the most common types of letters supporting an application we'll see are institutional support, consultants, advisory boards, stakeholders, advocates. There are a myriad of other kinds of letters that you might need to include depending on the specifics of your application. But if you have any of these involved in your application, it might be worth thinking through whether a letter support from them would strengthen the application. So kind of in a similar way, kind of walking through the requirements of facilities and resource descriptions. We like to think, especially, within UCLA and our CTSI partners, most institutions, we have so many facilities and resources, and you don't have, you can't really list them all. So it's helpful to think through like what's needed for a successful project. So like, what do you need on your particular application to achieve the aims of your project? If there is a facility or resource that falls into that, it should go in here. But it's really, we're not throwing everything at the wall. We're really trying to be as narrow and specific as we can to make sure that those resources and facilities are specific for your application. So one of the ways that I like to think about this is if you're including a resource or facility description, can you add a sentence that specifically says how that relates to your application? So you're saying like, we're using this center because they're providing data from their annual survey. If you can't answer that question, chances are that facility resource doesn't actually belong in your application. So one of the frequently asked questions we get is, does a description exist elsewhere? Chances are probably. The CTSI website has a bunch of the most frequently requested boilerplate, so you can always start there. You can also always email my office. We have over 1,000 pages of resources that we've collected over the years from all kinds of institutions, across the UCs and nationally. And so chances are it exists somewhere. Most of your co-investigators that you work with are also going to have blurbs that are specific to them as well. And so the idea is always, the more that you can capitalize on things that already exist, the less work it ends up for you in the long run. So you're not having to like rewrite a description of all of you and, the Lundquist Institute. Chances are somebody already has that written up. And so kind of thinking through who might have these existing resources so you're not trying to scramble and write them up yourself can really help streamline the process for you. Another good thing that I like to check when I'm working on an application is, have you mentioned resources somewhere else in your application? So if you're, talking in your narrative about a specific facility where some tests are going to be, do you have a description of that facility in the facility section? So I always like to think holistically about the grant application. Each piece should be speaking and referencing all the other pieces so that it looks more cohesive. And so one of the things that I'm always interested in is, sometimes you'll mention something in passing and then not think about the fact that maybe it can be fully described elsewhere. So you can go into more detail about the importance or the details of that resource. So this is one of the ways where you can do kind of a cross check to make sure that your document is sort of self-reflective in that way. So some things I've talked about, I think it's helpful to kind of look through what are like the major categories that would belong in facilities and resources, scientific environment, clinic, laboratory animals, etc. So obviously don't include these if they're not applicable to your application, but having those sort of major category ideas can give you a sense of how to structure the document and think through, okay, if I do have a clinical component, where are the facilities of that clinic, or what resources do I have access to because I'm using that clinic? If it's a laboratory, it's, what is available in my laboratory that is going to be used for this project. And so you can start thinking through those questions to figure out what actually goes into this section. So this is not going to apply to every application, but if you have a human subjects component, thinking through those requirements, is your study a clinical trial or is it exempt from human subjects protections? Those will all alter how you put together your application, how much documentation you need and the format it needs to be in. And so as you're in the planning phases, it's helpful to get a sense of, if you have a human subject study, does it fall under the definition of a clinical trial or is it really just a study involving human subjects? If it is human subjects, but you're using data collected from a previous study that's not related, is it then exempt? Or is it, basic science study, or maybe you need to have a verb or animal section instead. So just asking these questions and kind of thinking through the different kinds of requirements that are involved. And again, there are so many different requirements based on the type of human subjects. I don't have time to go into them. But we do have a pretty thorough website that goes into each type of human subject study. And so you get a good sense of like the different kinds of documentation that you have to put together. But it's a good planning question to ask. So after that, I did want to highlight, and this is not for typically not for the grant submission process, unless you're submitting an NSF application, but the other support documentation, similar to the biosketches, has changed for applications on or after January 25th. So just a note that the format is updated. There's new templates available on the NIH website. I think NSF requires you to use their online component, but just a heads up that there are a lot of recent changes. So you're now including active and pending completed support, person months for each year, current budget, which they give you a little like table to fill out. There's a new section called in-kind contributions, which kind of leads back to the previous slide on biosketches and scientific appointments. And then if you have any foreign appointments where the contracts are written in a non-English language, they have to be translated. And then the documents have to be signed by like DocuSign or there's some kind of e-signature option. So at UCLA, there's an online system and there's where you can do this through. But just a heads up that there are some new requirements for this section. So the pieces that I went through are sort of the ones that my office most frequently works on. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a wealth of other resources available for different other aspects of the application process. And so I kind of wanted to highlight some of those too. So when it comes to grant writing, sometimes you just need to see what a good grant looks like. So the CTSI has a grants library of successfully funded grants there's like K awards, R's, some Center grants, there's some diversity supplements there, and you can request access to this. It's view only, so you can't copy and paste things to take what other people have written, but it gives you a good idea of what does a good grant look like, and you'll notice there's a lot of difference in how different applications are written, but it was funded, so it was good enough to get funded, and so it can really help you if you are really just starting out from scratch and you really don't know where to start, give you a good sense of what a strong application looks like. If you're putting together an application, maybe with the human subjects or clinical trials component, or maybe even not, you can get biostat consultations to help set you on the right path. If it's determined that you need biostatistical support for the application, they can help you put that together as well. And this is just a screenshot of their, I think they're still doing all of their consultations remote as well, but another area of support that you can access. And then some online resources that I've found really helpful in terms of like grant writing and editing. The K&R workshop, K Scholar Society webpage has a lot of online resources already for, some of them are pre-recorded webinars, there's some slides, and kind of go over some of these topics like, how do you craft a significance and innovation sections? How do you craft the approach sections? Like the meat of your application, like how to do that, are already available. And so and these are available to anybody. You don't need a login or anything. You just click on access them. And it gives you a good idea of how to put those sections together as well. If you have an application that involves special populations, then one resource I've heard just wonderful things about is the special populations grant reviews. So they're sort of like mock study sections where if you can submit your grant narrative ahead of time, I think they have a 6-week requirement. So it's they'll put together sort of a mock study section and give you some feedback about how to improve your application from a reviewer perspective. So it can be really helpful for helping to really tailor your application and get some critiques before it gets submitted officially. Shout out to community engagement. They do really great consultations. If you know you need or would like to engage like a community component on your application, they can be a really great place to start, especially if you're applying to a funding opportunity that has that as a specific requirement as well. If your application involves a human subjects or clinical trials component, there's a lot of resources available on the ResearchGo website that kind of give you some templates and boilerplate and things like that to help get you started. Especially if you're struggling with how to put together a say like a clinical trial description for an application. So there's a lot of like really good resources there as well. Now, if you know that your application is going to involve a multi-site clinical trial, you can also engage with the Trial Innovation Network. It's sort of a national network of administrators under NCATS that are there to provide expertise specifically for multi-site clinical trials. Every CTSA has a liaison. And so here at UCLA, that person is in my office. So we are also the local TIN office. So if your application falls under this category, you can also access just a wealth of resources from them as well. That might go beyond what's available at your local site. So, if you have sites that are struggling with standardized agreements for study startup, that's something that can help you, build templates or just give you consultations on how to approach some of these challenges. So that is also currently available. So then I get to the end of my slides. So I wanted to show this slide again. I did highlight a couple of these areas, but if I didn't touch on maybe a topic or a question that you had, I'm happy to answer that question. I think that there are slides on most of these things, but there might not have been, I don't know. So take a look at it and see, if there's particular areas of interest, you have questions. You can also come back at me during my office hours. They're also remote / Zoom these days, but I am definitely available to help if you just want, like, you have a random question you want answered, or if you need support for a grant application, you can always come and ask us. So those are my official slides. So I don't know if there are any questions that people have.
I am sure people have questions. Can I ask a quick one? Why do they keep changing the bio and other support? It doesn't seem like it's getting better. It just seems like they change it all the time. Is there any good reason?
Great question. Yes, I agree. So let me go back to this bio sketch slide here. Or where is it? So the NIH, in all their good wisdom, really tries to not give you more administrative burden than they already have. And I think in doing so, possibly do the opposite sometimes. So in getting rid of Section D, which was the major component here, one of the justifications was that when you're submitting NIH applications, During the just-in-time process, you're required to submit your other support documentation. And that essentially has all of your research support in it already, in addition to even more stuff. And so they've now made it optional for you to include research support in your biosketch so that you don't have to do it twice because it's duplicative and they really just want it in one place. However, I think that, at least at UCLA, the sort of school of thought is having research support, even if it's in section A, really adds strength to your application because it's showing the reviewers what you've done in the past, because just in time is after review has already taken place. And so reviewers don't really get to see it, but that was one reason. The other reason for adding the scientific appointments was just this harder drive to have faculty be more upfront about like foreign and domestic appointments that are maybe outside of their primary institution. And so I think they felt they had to address that. But yeah, I feel like I've been at the CTSI for about 10 years, and I think we've gone through 4 different biosketch versions. Just keeps us on our toes, I guess. I think they always have a justification for it, but whether that's warranted, I don't know.
Thank you.
All right, I guess if there's no other questions, I can let you guys go early.
There's got to be other questions. I mean, you went through so much stuff. I mean, a lot of it, I just wonder if you could, to me, that the text and the really what you're after is the most important part, but you need all this other stuff. And a lot of times people use help for getting the bios together and all that kind of stuff. But it seems like the heart of it has got to be the writing that goes into the main text, the research aims and what you're going to do. So if you're going to, is there a priority? I mean, is it just that everything has to be as good as possible, or, because there's so much for people to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The writing, the specific aims and the research strategy are the most important part, and that has to be strong and clear above anything else. I think the parts that my office works on, because we're sort of the administrative support, we're just making sure that all these other pieces are supportive of that. And so that's, I guess, where I'm coming from. I keep in my mind is everything else that you're putting in there that's not the research strategy, is it strengthening your application in some way? And so we want to make sure we're only including things that add strength and not create too many questions. And there's a lot of resources for writing the research strategy or just having somebody review it. But I think having, multiple levels of review, like having a mentor review it, or, going through some kind of consultation. My office often will do a review for early stage investigators, just to make sure that the application reads clearly and that the arguments make sense from an outsider perspective. And you're right. I think above all else, that's always the most important thing that you want to spend the majority of your time on, and everything else is just in support of that, of your main argumentation, I think.
But I think it's also important. We don't want people putting all that work into a great proposal and then it's rejected because it's not responsive for some things. And then also, if there's 5 really good proposals, they're in a different mood in scoring your proposal if all the other pieces are really well done and in place. And so we're trying, yeah, absolutely, as Ron said, if your science sucks and your proposal's not written well, all this other stuff is not going to help you. But if that's good, then these are the nuances that can help to differentiate you from the other strong proposals and hopefully get you funded.
Yeah, that's a great point. So
And,
what about, oh, go ahead. You're not done. Go ahead, Keith.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, and and having people help to do all that other stuff lets you work on your science a little more.
Right. Yeah, I guess I was trying to get at that maybe the PI should be working primarily on that part, and hopefully you have good
Right.
people that are helping with some other stuff.
Right, absolutely.
So what about, it seems like in the heart of the application, a lot of times people like to see figures or tables, even though they're squished. And I don't know why, but it seems to be very common, at least in my experience, that gets folded in there somehow. I don't find them all that valuable a lot of times, but it seems like reviewers are very partial to that. I don't know, maybe that's just the way I see it.
I think that's a good point. I think some studies have been done about, just reader fatigue if something is just straight text, and for 12 pages it can get drying for your eyes, so I think having something that breaks up as a visual can be helpful if it's and like Dr. Norris, like you were saying, if all applications being equal, the one that has the nice figures is going to get a little bit more attention as well. I like to, I'm not a graphics person, but I have a specific sort of UCLA style that I have a color palette that I use. So everything that I do very much looks the same. And so there's a uniformity to the application to kind of give it a little bit of something without being too distracting. And I think that can be helpful, but it's obviously not something that is required for the most part either. So I think it can be helpful when used well, but it can also be pretty distracting if it's just all graphics all over the place, or they're squished or expanded or blurry, things like that.
Yeah.
Do you have any strategies that you use for trying to reduce the content in the application? Sometimes, getting through a few iterations of writing, you end up being over 12 pages. Mm-hmm. Any suggestions around that?
For the creative editing to get it down to the
12 pages? If that.
Yeah, I think that for us old people who only think in 25 single space pages, the 12-page format is still hard. But I think what you want to do is you want to really save your space for explaining your methods. And, obviously you have all these other sections, but, if you have complicated methods, if you don't convince the reader that you've got, clear hypotheses, a well-articulated study population, well-justified and cleared methods, that the project doesn't look feasible, then you're not going to score well. So, I always say, like, you can kind of, those other sections, like, where you put the background information, and you can, I think with this format, you can go a little thinner on those sections. Like, most people on study section, they accept that health disparities exist, right? So you don't have to wax eloquently for a paragraph trying to convince them, and so I think for me, it's really those core things are what's going to drive my score. It's really the description of the project and not all the, peripherals. The peripherals have to be there. They're required sections, and they can't be done poorly, but they can be done shorter, I would say. But other people like Keith and Ron, and who write grants all the time, how do you approach the 12 pages?
Yeah, I do it the same way, but what I do psychologically for me is, right, so the NIH grant has a 1/2-inch margin around the paper. I usually start out with a 0.8-inch margin, which gives me less space per se. And so I work there and then try to get close to 12. And then at the end, I know I can always change the margin. I have to change the margin, right? So you change the margin, all of a sudden you get all this extra space. And so that helps me, I think, in framing it just psychologically from there. And then as Carol said, I think it gets easy to like want to put a lot of stuff in the significance and talk about how significant it is. And it's really not that you just need to make your case it's significant, because what's going to drive your score is your methods, really. And is going to be your approach and your innovation is going to drive your score. Significance, they either think it's a significant problem, you're doing something that's important, your diabetes affects a lot of people, it's an important project, that's fine. You know, if it's a project to make Keith's garden better, people probably not going to think it's that significant. Your score won't be, no matter what your methods are. But you don't need, in a page, you don't, you know, some people have 2 pages of significance, versus you could have a half page of significance. And so that's where you can save a lot of space there.
Thank you, Carol and Keith. It's great suggestions. I'm going to take it and run with it.
Any other questions? Otherwise, Robin, well, thank you for joining us. People probably will be calling you, I suspect.
Okay, yes, thank you for having me.
Yeah,
RCMAR CHIME does the best presentations. I visit your YouTube page all the time, so I'm glad to be included.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone.
Right. So we'll